3 weeks ago, Nelson Mandela came to Washington and visited George Bush in the White House. And what was barely mentioned was that Mr. Mandela is on the U.S. terrorist watch list, which means he's not allowed to fly on airplanes. It's a serious question as to how he gained access to the White House as a result of that being on that list. But what was also not mentioned was that he's on the terrorist watch list because years ago, apartheid South Africa asked the United States to put that label on him. The U.S. government complied. Of course, we know that apartheid Israel has asked the U.S. to put Hamas and Hezbollah on the terrorist watch list as well. But who was omitted on the U.S. government's terrorist watch list was a succession of Israeli prime ministers, many of whom were the heads of various terrorist organizations. Menachem Begin, for example, was the head of the Irgun, one of the most violent and vicious terrorist groups operating in Palestine. That was back when the Zionist movement was executing its Plan Dalet, which was the blueprint for ethnically cleansing Palestine to make room for an exclusive Jewish state. The Irgun was joined by the Stern Gang in a joint effort, that's another terrorist organization, in a joint effort to massacre many Palestinian villages during the execution of Plan Dalet, the most famous being Deir Yassin. Then there was Ariel Sharon, who was in the Israeli army and was in command of a special terrorist unit whose goal was to terrorize Palestinians so they would never again think of trying to get the land back that the Zionist movement stole from them by force of arms. When I was in the Senate, and when Menachem Begin won the election for prime minister in the 1970s, he was invited to do a victory lap around Washington, D.C., one such party taking place here in the U.S. Senate. Virtually every single senator attended the party thrown for Mr. Begin, and I also attended. And I promised myself that I would say absolutely nothing. I wanted to let Mr. Begin savor his moment in the sun as the new Prime Minister of Israel. I sat silently listening to the scathing cross-examination by a number of very courageous U.S. senators. The toughest question that he was asked was, "Mr. Prime Minister, do you think the Arabs really want peace?" I could contain myself no longer. I rose and asked for recognition. And I said, "Mr. Prime Minister," and I wanted to make sure he knew who was accosting him. I said, "My name is Abourezk. I'm from South Dakota, and I heard you on the radio this morning where you were telling your audience that you would never negotiate with the PLO. My question is this: if you refuse to negotiate with the PLO, and if you say you're really interested in making peace, how can you refuse to talk to the party that is your antagonist?" Mr. Begin pointed his finger in the air like this and began saying, "Who is the PLO?" And I interrupted him. I said, "The PLO represents the Palestinian people, and they're at least as legitimate as the Irgun was back when you ran it." Well, pandemonium struck the U.S. Senate. The chairman of the conference, Senator Alan Cranston of California, immediately adjourned the meeting before I could make any more trouble. As the senators were filing out of the room, I heard John Glenn, the senator from Ohio, make his immortal statement, "Abourezk could start a riot in an empty hall." There's little difference between what was done to the Indians and what is being done to the Palestinians today. The Zionists moved into Palestine, slaughtered a great many Palestinians, then frightened the rest, ultimately taking over all their lands. But first, the Palestinians, in an effort to defend themselves, as the UN Charter allows, had to be declared as terrorists. That was the first step in justifying the ongoing slaughter of the innocents, as well as those who took up arms to defend their land. Once so defined, it was never a public relations problem for Israel and for the U.S. government when Israel undertakes what they call targeted assassinations, or bombing terrorist targets, many of which are innocent women and children. It even becomes routine in the Congress to overwhelmingly pass resolutions. One recently denounced the death of one Israeli by a Qassam rocket fired from the Gaza by Hamas, while ignoring during the same week the Israeli slaughter of 120 Palestinian civilians.
What happens if there is no agreement by the end of this year? And it seems that till December there won't be any agreement. So what will happen? And what is happening on the ground? What the situation on the ground today that prevents achieving an agreement? The common wisdom goes as following. Based on their joint commitment for democracy and justice, Israel and the United States push forward the division of historical Palestine to two nation states. That's the common wisdom. Unfortunately, reality fails to support this conclusion. Israel is not engaged in a separation process from the Palestinian territories. The information that I have on the talks between Israel and the Abbas government of the West Bank does not let me to assume that by the end of this year, they will produce a viable Palestinian state. Moreover, instead of establishing a border that excludes the Palestinians of 67 land, Israel includes them in the framework of one ruling regime. I suggest seeing the one ruling regime as the reality today. And the reality is, in my view, that the division between 67 and 48 territories does not exist on the ground. It exists in international law books, international diplomacy, not anymore on the ground. We have a new reality in the region. Through its settlements expansion, Israel established an ethno-security regime over the Palestinians living in the area between Jordan River and the Mediterranean. In other words, the one state is not a future solution, but a current problematic and discriminatory reality. To sum up, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict moved back to be an ethnic struggle after a short period under Oslo Agreement from 1993 to 2000, when it was gradually shifting towards a border conflict. And this concerns me a lot, that we are now in a new situation, back to an ethnic conflict with the Palestinians, not a border conflict. And we include the Palestinians in our state in a process which we, the Jews, are becoming a minority. We are almost a minority. But we are powerful. So the almost powerful minority rules the almost majority. If it does not exist already, then in few years, a Jewish minority will rule over the Palestinian majority due to its power and force. So as an Israeli and as a Jew and a person who concerns about peace and justice, I would like to suggest that Israelis, Palestinians, and Americans, together with all those who care on democracy, all of us are called to expose this reality, to reject this one-state reality, and which is also anti-democratic reality, and replace it with the two-states solution. It should be the one-state reality that already exists on the ground, in my view, in my analysis, should be rejected normatively and politically. Instead, the two-state solution, based on internationally recognized 67 borders, must take its place. Thank you very much.